Bold moves on defense spending and promises to act fast on federal projects are evidence the government is willing to put its money where its mouth is. But where will the money come from? Paul Kershaw is founder of Generation Squeeze. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
So we had deficits in this country before we upped our defense spending in a dramatic way. It's not really a subject of conversation. We're not in an election, so I don't know who will complain about it, if anybody. But this will, of course, grow our deficits even further. How concerned should we be?
I think we need to be concerned. I think we need a serious conversation about revenue in this country because, our most recent information is from the fall economic statement a year ago, which showed we had a $42 billion deficit. Now it's going to be above 60 with the Liberal platform. And I'm not sure entirely the degree to which the most recent announcement, the NATO commitment, will drive it still further. It is fine to say we want to make investments and run deficits for capital investments. There's good reason to do that. But we are running large operating deficits. That's been what our problem has been for years. And the problem really still comes down to a failure decades ago to plan for the healthy retirements of our aging loved ones, the boomers in our lives. And if we don't have a serious conversation right now about what's driving those operating deficits, it makes it so much harder to find the cash we need to invest to meet our defense ambitions and to invest to meet the infrastructure goals we have for the building Canada's one economy instead of 13 provincial economies.
So, there would be purists, Paul, who will say, and those of us who lived through the 90s might find ourselves in this category, a surplus is what we should be looking for. Run balance, and if you can't run balance, have more. However, the change you're talking about, where the government will account differently for operations from capital, is that going to should it affect how we talk about a percentage of GDP? Because right now we allow them to say it's a percentage of GDP because some of this is investment in our growth. We can grow our way out of debt, right? We're making investments in things that will pay off. Once we put that in its own bucket called capital, should we have an absolutely balanced operating budget?
A balanced operating budget, and to the degree that you're talking about, a surplus when we're not in a recession. And I think that the key issue that we need to recognize is that as we have an aging population, inevitably that will have a dampening influence on our growth. And we just have to account for that, which is all the more reason why we need a commission, we need a task force to actually talk about revenue and get beyond the kind of magical thinking that's evolved into our elections, where we as voters say, please promise me new spending and tax cuts simultaneously. Yes, some tax cuts can spur more productivity and some revenue improvements as a result. But we are dreaming in Technicolor if we think that we can close the gap between our spending on an aging population now, which matters. This is my mom we're talking about. Mm-hmm. But it is leaving very, very large deficits. Like at the federal level, the current federal deficit can be accounted for entirely by increase in old age security. In the Ontario budget, its deficit can be accounted for entirely by the increase on spending on medical care for those over 65. That conversation needs to come to light in our society if we want money left over to invest in other priorities like national defense, like housing, like economic growth, like AI.
We don't have a ton of time here. You cover this. You talk a lot about it. What's the best way to get people focused on that? Old people react to this because they feel like, look, we are entitled to this stuff. Don't take it away. How do you get young people paying more attention to it?
Well, in Australia, they have generational accounting reports every 4 years that the government does. The EU has a commissioner for intergenerational fairness. Wales has an act for well-being for future generations. Canada badly needs those kinds of government infrastructure to, bring this conversation to light and to actually showcase to our aging loved ones that the entitlements they're talking about that they are deserving of, we want them to have good care, but they are not things they fully prepaid for. And that's a conversation that needs to come to light if we're going to have any money left over to meet other national objectives. Thanks for being here, Paul. Always appreciate it. Pleasure. Paul Kershaw is founder of Generation Squeeze. Time for the takeaway and punching way outside our weight class. As the G7 gets underway in Kananaskis, Alberta this weekend, it's worth remembering that Canada is somewhat lucky to have a seat at this table. Other world leaders gather under the G7 banner, so it's possible we get an invite, even if we weren't part of the core team. That we were originally invited to join by U.S. President Gerald Ford is a telling reminder of how our proximity to and relationship with a mighty U.S.
has shaped the world's understanding of Canada, but it's never been only about that. From our contribution to 2 world wars to the creation of global peacekeeping, Canada has been engaged in the world with the mentality of a heavyweight, even if we've always been middleweight. And more so than ever, it's important for Canada and its government to behave in that globally focused fashion. As the United States pulls back on foreign aid and investments, Canada could double down, filling a void and not only solving humanitarian crises, but also playing the role we've historically played of a balanced, measured approach, but one rooted firmly in the shared values of our allies. It's what earned us a right at the table, and with the largest players on the world stage acting in a spirit of isolation, Canada has an opportunity to be expansive. Yes, we're small, although with one of the top 10 largest economies in the globe, not that small, and we can have outsized influence and lead by example. With a government that is very much focused on moving fast on projects in Canada's self-interest, the list of those items can include actions beyond our borders. We may not be able to replace every dollar spent by the U.S., but we can make an impact in the world and do it in ways that serve the interests of our partners. Sometimes those interests may not have obvious or immediate domestic payoffs, but that they exist in this interconnected world where relationships create influence is still very much true. My takeaway? Canada has a role to play in the new world order, and sometimes you have to do the work to keep your spot in the ring. That's Taking Stock for this week. I'm Amanda Lang. Thanks for being with us.